I was going to originally end this series on English history after 5 episodes, but after doing Chinese history all the way through present day, I decided to go back and do the same for the English. To recap, Robert Walpole became the first prime minister in 1721 after the rest of the king's ministers were dismissed for their role in the South Sea Company's stock market bubble, allowing him to wield unrivaled power. If you remember, during the English Civil War, the royalists who supported the king were known as the Cavaliers, and they fought the parliamentarians who were nicknamed the Roundheads. After Oliver Cromwell's death and the restoration of King Charles II, the Royalists became the Tory party, and the parliamentarians became the Whig party, which could now execute limited power from Parliament. When Charles II died and was followed by his Catholic younger brother James II from the Scottish House of Stuart, widespread discontent among Protestants allowed for the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which saw his daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband William the Orange take control of the kingdom. When William passed away, he was followed by Mary's cousin Anne, which saw a return of power to the House of Stuart. By 1701, staunch Whigs in Parliament had passed the Exclusion Act, which would prohibit any Catholics from serving on the throne of England. And this forced the House of Stuart to pass their claim onto the House of Hanover under King George. This house, having some of its power originating from mainland Europe, was unpopular, which saw a decline in the power of the king in favor of Parliament. So many members of the Tories were Jacobites, meaning they believed in the cause of the eventual restoration of the House of Stuart, meaning George distrusted the Tories and instead placed his allegiance with the Whigs, who would remain in power for the next 50 years. In 1722, just 1 year into Robert Walpole's time as prime minister, a Tory conspiracy known as the Atterbury Plot served as the catalyst for his consolidation and hold on power. The plot was named for Francis Atterbury, who was a high-up Tory bishop who attempted to lead a group of French brandy smugglers and Jacobite extremists to overthrow the king, but was foiled when the details were leaked to Walpole. Once the details of the plot were made public, any real chance of a Jacobite restoration vanished. Walpole governed alongside his counterpart in the House of Lords, Charles Townshend, who gained personal fame from promoting the turnip as a crop to alleviate the famine which occurred in his time. When George died and was followed by George II, the Walpole-Townshend ministry continued but was weakened as Walpole and Townshend could not agree on Britain's policy towards their alliances with mainland European powers following the War of Spanish Succession. That war saw parties loyal to the Bourbon dynasty in France compete with parties loyal to the Austrian House of Habsburg, vie for control over Spain, and was ended in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht, which agreed for Britain to support France and the existing Bourbon kings in Spain, with the express agreement that Spain and France would never merge. Britain and Spain itself would briefly go to war in 1727 in the Anglo-Spanish War, which saw Spain attempt and fail to take Gibraltar from the British, and the British trying and also failing to do the same with Spain's strategic settlement of Portobello in Panama, causing the war to end after 2 years in the signing of the Treaty of Seville, which stipulated that the British would not participate in trade with the Spanish colonies in the Americas, and a guarantee that British captains would allow the voluntary boarding of Spanish inspectors to ensure that trade embargoes were being followed. Townshend supported a continued alliance with France, while Walpole preferred an alliance with Austria. So when Townshend resigned from his position, Walpole pushed the king to sign the Treaty of Vienna in 1731, which officially ended the Anglo-French alliance in efforts to contain any increases in French power, beginning the Anglo-Austrian alliance. Many members of both parties began to become weary of Walpole's consolidation of power, which they saw as tyrannical, and a new temporary party was formed called the Country Party, which brought elements of the left and right together under the shared belief that an unchecked Walpole could be a threat to the British people. It was the frequent party writings of the Country Party that made their way to the American colonies and began the widespread discussion and disdain for the monarchy and top-down control that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Walpole used his influence to keep the British from intervening in the bloody Polish War of Secession, which allowed him to lower taxes and balance the budget. He attempted to overhaul the land tax by creating the kingdom's first excise tax on wine and tobacco, but after it became public that he made revealing remarks about how it was easier to collect taxes from merchants than gentry, the merchants protested and tanked the new taxes. In 1736, 3 convicted smugglers trying to evade a gin tax that didn't pass were publicly executed in Edinburgh by hanging. The bodies were left up in the town square to serve as an example, which angered many of the local sailors who had a positive view of the smugglers, and one sailor went to cut down the smugglers' bodies so they could be buried. The British officer overseeing the executions, Captain John Porteous, decided to shoot the sailor who was trying to remove the bodies, but he missed and hit an innocent bystander, causing a widespread riot to ensue. To dispel the fast-growing crowd, Captain Porteous made the disastrous decision to order the indiscriminate firing into the crowd by his soldiers, killing 6 people. While his brutality broke up the crowd in the moment, a new hatred for Porteous and British control began to boil over, and a trial was ordered which found Captain Porteous guilty for killing innocent civilians, and he was sentenced to death. When rumors spread that Walpole was going to possibly send a pardon up to Edinburgh for the captain, an angry civilian mob stormed the jail and pulled him from his cell and lynched him in the same square he committed the atrocities. The diminishing level of control in Scotland alarmed Robert Walpole and the Whig Party in power, and this insecurity contributed to the passing of the Licensing Act of 1737, which required all theatrical plays, which were one of the primary forms of entertainment at the time, to be approved by the government to ensure that the new censor of anti-government language was enforced. In 1739, against Walpole's best efforts to keep the kingdom out of war, reports came back to London that British Captain Robert Jenkins had been mistreated when his cargo ship was boarded by Spanish inspectors, and even had his ear cut off, which led to public outcry against the current stipulations of the Treaty of Seville, which caused the British to declare war on the Spanish, beginning the War of Jenkins' Ear, which was largely a naval war. The British mission was a disaster in that they lost 4 times the number of men and ships as the Spanish, primarily due to tropical diseases that the English had less immunity to. The final blow to the British resolve was their massive defeat at the Battle of Cartagena, which gave them no choice but to surrender and accept the status quo. The loss of the war caused Walpole's approval ratings to tank, and he was forced to resign in 1742, shortly after the surrender, and he was followed by fellow Whig Spencer Compton. Compton was already quite old at the time and was stressed, and with the stress of the job, it caused him to have a heart attack the following year, which ended his life, and he was followed by Henry Pelham. By this time, the Austrian War of Secession was raging in Europe over the ascension of Maria Theresa to the throne, something that France and Prussia saw as an opportunity to take Austrian possessions. Honoring the Anglo-Austrian alliance, Pelham saw Britain come to her aid along with Hanover and the Dutch Republic, who formed an alliance referred to as the Pragmatic Alliance. Prussia took particular offense to Maria's ascension, since unlike the British, women could not be head of royalty in their society, and therefore many believed she was an invalid ruler. In addition to being obligated by the alliance, Britain had interest in trying to rein in the rapidly growing Prussian power base and hopefully dissuade any ideas of Germanic unity so that they could still retain Hanover. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart launched a surprise revolt in Scotland while most of the British army was preoccupied in Europe. His goal was to place his father, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Prince of Wales and the son of King James II, the last Stuart king, onto the throne. The Jacobites, with their last gasp, led an army of 8,000 to invade England, but were quickly repelled. They then seized a British-controlled castle in Scotland, but were only able to hold it for an hour before being captured. In response, several severe anti-Scot laws were passed, including the Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746, which forcibly dismantled the feudal clan system still in place in Scotland, and the Vesting Act of 1747, which authorized Parliament to seize the property and title to land from lords found guilty of treason, which very much applied to the Stuarts. By 1748, the Pragmatic Alliance had lost the War of Austrian Succession, and Britain was forced to reduce her military size, something Pelham was able to spin as a positive for being a tax reduction. In 1751, he proclaimed the Gregorian calendar to be the new standard of Britain in order to help modernize the empire. Back when William of Orange was king and anti-French sentiment was at an all-time high, the popular liquor, French brandy, was replaced with William the Orange's preferred alcohol, gin. Gin first became popular with the nobility, but soon found its way into everyday people's habits as countless distillers were able to perfect mass production of the product, aided by the fact it did not have a shelf life. For the next 50 years, the popularity of gin soared to the point that the government began to notice the widespread drunkenness in the streets and the negative effects it had caused, which they dubbed the gin craze. Several laws were passed attempting to reduce the consumption of gin, but none were effective until the Gin Act of 1751, which introduced additional regulations on who could produce and sell alcohol, which did finally curtail consumption. Pelham's last significant legislative achievement was the Jew Bill, which allowed Jews to become naturalized citizens. He died shortly after its passage in 1754 and was followed by his brother Thomas Pelham. By the way, Thomas had to deal with a growing conflict with France regarding overlaps in their territory in North America. The English colonists were growing antsy to cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle the new Ohio Valley, which would put them in conflict with the French fur traders and the Native Americans already living in the area. At this point, the English colonies had a population of 1.5 million compared to New France's 90,000, so many felt that it was justified to expand west at their expense. To help strengthen their claims, the colonial governor of Virginia ordered a young General George Washington to lead a small brigade to construct a military installation in southwest Pennsylvania known as Fort Necessity, which would protect colonists as they crossed into the Ohio Valley. In July of that year, the French and their native allies attacked Fort Necessity in what would be Washington's first combat experience. His small brigade was overwhelmed and forced to surrender and retreat to Virginia, stalling any plans for expansion. The Battle of Fort Necessity would be the official start of the French and Indian War between Britain and France over North American supremacy. When word got back to Britain about Washington's defeat, Thomas Pelham made the decision to send the regular British army, led by General Edward Braddock, in to make a more concerted effort to take the fort. Additionally, his plans called for a colonial army to be raised, which would simultaneously march north to attack and seize Nova Scotia from the French. After Fort Necessity had been overrun, the French looted and dismantled the fort, instead building their own heavily fortified Fort Duquesne at the site of present-day Pittsburgh. Braddock arrived in the colonies with his forces in 1755, and with George Washington's assistance began to march to take Fort Duquesne. The British expected to easily take the fort, but were surprised when they encountered a much larger native force assisting the French. General Braddock ordered his troops to attack the fort by crossing the Monongahela River, beginning the eponymous battle. The attack was a disaster, with the British losing almost 1,000 soldiers, 10 times more than the French and their Indian allies. In the fighting, General Braddock was shot in the lung and died on the battlefield, which caused the army columns to fall apart, forcing George Washington to lead a retreat to Philadelphia. Today, the area of the battlefield and the Pittsburgh suburb that surround it are named in Braddock's honor. The colonial army was much more successful in their endeavors, and they were able to capture the French maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and what would become the state of Maine. These territories were already occupied by French-speaking settlers known as Acadians. The Acadians were forcibly deported from the Maritimes in an event known as the Great Expulsion, with the majority of the Acadians moving to Louisiana, where they went on to form a new, unique local culture that people know as Cajuns today. So, and then in present day, there are about 1.2 million direct descendants of the Acadians living primarily within Louisiana. At this point, the conflict between France and England could no longer be restricted to North America, and questions of global supremacy began to be made. In 1756, Britain officially declared war on France, beginning the wider 7 Years' War. This major challenge to the world order would see a shuffling of alliances in what would become known as the Diplomatic Revolution, in which the eternal rivals of Austria and France finally settled their differences and signed a treaty against Britain, who they saw as a rising threat. This forced Britain to begin looking towards their historical enemy of Prussia as a replacement to the now defunct Anglo-Austrian alliance, beginning the Anglo-Prussian alliance. The first instance of battle in the European theater saw Britain and France's navies meet off the coast of a Spanish island in the Battle of Minorca. The French won the battle and badly damaged the British fleet. The loss was seen as an embarrassment and a failure of leadership on the part of Thomas Pelham, and he was forced to resign and was replaced by William Cavendish. Cavendish looked to quell public outrage regarding the loss of the Battle of Minorca by arresting and ordering the execution of Admiral John Byng against the wishes of King George II, who wished to spare the admiral's life. After the execution, public opinion turned against Cavendish, and under pressure from King George II, Thomas Pelham was reinstated as Prime Minister in 1757. Along with his contemporary in the House of Commons, William Pitt the Elder, the two Parliament leaders oversaw a change in military strategy as the British focused on seizing French colonial assets from around the globe rather than focusing on the European continent. Spain joined the war on France's side in 1758, seeing the conflict as an opportunity to invade and capture Portugal, Great Britain's longest-standing ally. In fact, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is still in place today and is considered the oldest ongoing alliance in the world, having been entered into all the way back in 1373. The Spanish would go on to lose their war and would be punished along with the rest of the eventual losers. The mobilization of British troops around the world caused the British Isles to be left vulnerable, something that the French planned to capitalize on by planning a massive invasion of the islands in 1759. These plans, thankfully, had to be scrapped after mounting a naval battle losses forced the French to abandon these goals. Despite their continued military success, the new King George III did not trust the growing power of the Whigs, and in 1762, shortly before victory, Thomas Pelham was dismissed and replaced by the first Tory Prime Minister, John Stuart, ending the 50 years of Whig supremacy. John Stuart would oversee the end of the Seven Years' War, with Britain and Prussia coming out victorious with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which saw France lose Canada and the Louisiana Territory to Britain, along with several Caribbean islands. With the war over, John Stuart believed military expenditures should be cut, but that troops still needed to be deployed to protect the colonies, so his solution was to enact a new cider tax on every barrel of cider produced, a common alcoholic drink produced in England. This new tax created massive public backlash, and after a popular newspaper published a satirical article about how John Stuart was having a secret affair with the Princess of Wales, who was the daughter of George III, he resigned to avoid any further falling out with the king and quietly returned to Parliament in 1763, being followed by George Grenville, and handed power back to the Whigs after only a year-long intermission. Grenville attempted to avoid the public backlash of the cider tax by this time levying the new taxes instead on the American colonial population, with the introduction of the previously discussed Stamp Act of 1765. Stamps had already been taxed in England, so taxing them in the colonies seemed like a natural progression. The colonists did not see it this way, and along with the passing of the controversial Quartering Act, which forced colonists to incur expenses related to housing British soldiers whenever asked, this led to widespread protests and unrest, forcing Grenville to resign, which he was followed by Charles Watson.